Welcome back to Roots Music History. On this podcast, we talk about the stories behind songs and legends, as well as moments in history and sometimes history in the making. On today's episode, we are talking about the legendary song Ave Maria. Ave Maria originated in the 19th century and is best known through the compositions of Franz Schubert and Charles Gounod.
Pronunciation police.
Charles Gounod.
Both Franz and Charles each created their own very distinct versions that have since become synonymous with the Latin prayer honoring the Virgin Mary. Both evolved into very powerful expressions of faith, transcending their origins to become beloved in various religious services, such as weddings, funerals, and even pop culture. The story behind Ave Maria is not only one of musical creativity, but also of transformation, as the song has journeyed through centuries to touch the hearts of audiences around the world, proving its timeless resonance and emotional depth. In this episode, we delve into the history and enduring legacy of Ave Maria, exploring how it became one of the most cherished pieces in Western music. The year was 1685. It was a cold and hazy morning in Eisenach, Germany in late March, or so we can assume based on the weather trends that I Googled before writing this story, when a little baby boy was born who we know today as Bach. Bach's father, Johann Bach Sr., came from a very long line of musicians. He was a violinist in Eisenach and worked very heavily as the director of the town's musicians. His mother was a homemaker who loved listening to Johann's music and singing and dancing along after family dinners. Bach's mother was 41 when he was born, and his father was 40. Johann Sebastian was Bach's formal name, and he was the fifth Johann boy born to Johann Sr. and his mother Maria. Now, I got a little bit confused about the naming conventions, but in the 1600s, the Protestant and Catholic families would name their children with three names: a first name, a middle name, and of course their surname or last name. But rather than how we do it today, where we have a first name that you call the person by, and then the middle name that isn't really referenced, and then the family name, they would use the first name as a saint's name for every boy and every girl. Johann was very commonly and almost entirely used for males who were Protestant. George was pretty often used if the family was Catholic. If a Protestant family had a girl, they would begin her name commonly with Maria or Anna or Elizabeth. And if the family was Catholic and had a girl, they would commonly name her Katerina or Margareta. The middle name then was the child's call name, which would be used in daily life. So, Johann Sebastian Bach was the fifth boy born to his parents and the fifth boy to be named Johann with the first name Johann. But he was the only child to have the middle name Sebastian, and he would have always been called Sebastian by his family and friends. For purposes of this episode, I will just refer to him as Bach, since that is how we all recognize him and his music today. Bach's life took a very tragic turn when both of his parents tragically died within 1 year of each other when he was just 9 years old. The death of his parents led him even further into the music scene and gave him a newfound desire to fine-tune his skills and expand his knowledge as he grew into more complex compositions. And that's exactly what he did for the next 26 years of his life after his parents died. Now, 13 years after his parents' death, he married a woman named Barbara. Barbara, by the way, was his second cousin, slim pickings. And Bach and Barbara would go on to have 7 children together, 4 of which survived to adulthood. When Bach and Barbara were 35 years old, Barbara, sadly and tragically, also died. And this was in the year 1720. Bach remarried 1 year later in 1721 to a woman who you can tell by her name was Catholic because her name was Anna Magdalena. Together, he and Magdalena, who was 21 years old, had an additional 13 children. She also came from a very musical family and was a very talented soprano singer prior to her marriage with Bach. Just 1 year after his second wedding, Bach was working on a book. The purpose of this book was to show off a new tuning system that had just been introduced. introduced, called Well-Temperament. Unlike what had previously existed called equal temperament, where each semitone is equally spaced, Well-Temperaments slightly adjust intervals to allow different keys to have unique sonic characters, with certain intervals being more harmonious than others. But this tuning system allowed musicians to play in all 24 major and minor keys, although each key still had its own distinct sound and color. Included in this book's compilation was a piece called Prelude No. 1 in C major. Now, Bach initially wrote this as just a very simple yet harmonically rich introduction to the key of C major, but he did it in a way that really demonstrated his skill set at the same time. The pieces of work within the well-tempered clavier,
pronunciation police,
clavier,
didn't really take off in any sense of the word. It was, of course, bought and appreciated, but albeit mainly as a teaching tool rather than a widely publicized piece of work. After all, Bach's intent was really to use it to demonstrate a new tuning system that was called Well-Temperament. His tuning system was still very relatively new, and he really only shared it with his inner circle of friends and family and co-workers. And that is all this piece was for a very long time, a simple teaching tool. In 1750, at the age of 65, Bach passed away in Germany, and it wasn't until 21 years after Bach's death that a man was born in Scotland who would become a very pivotal man in Bach's legacy. His name was Walter Scott. At just 18 months old, Walter Scott came down with polio, which left him with a permanent limp for the remainder of his life. His early childhood was difficult and isolating because of this. His parents realized their son was feeling ostracized from his peers, unable to run and play with them, so to help him heal, they sent him to his grandparents' farm for extended periods of time frequently. His grandparents' farm was in the Scottish borders, a rural area with rolling hills and historic ruins. This experience immersed Walter Scott in the countryside, sparking his lifelong love for Scotland's landscape, folklore, and history. In the evenings and in his free time at the farm, Walter immersed himself in reading. He was primarily influenced by stories of Scottish history, but on top of loving to read, Walter also loved listening to people tell stories. Scott loved hearing stories from family members and locals, and this just fueled his fascination with the past and folklore. This passion for storytelling and history eventually led him to begin his own writing career. In his adolescent years, Walter Scott started reading works by Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, and all of the greatest poets and historians of his time. At 12, he began translating Latin texts. By the age of 15, he had entered the University of Edinburgh to study law. He published a few works before 1810, and then he published a poem that would change the world forever. The poem was called The Lady of the Lake. The poem tells the story of a woman named Ellen Douglas, the daughter of a Scottish nobleman who finds herself at the center of a political struggle between the land she is from, called the Highlands, and the Highland clan, the people of that land, and the royal forces of Scotland. The poem is divided into 6 cantos, each following a day in the narrative. The first one is called The Chase, and this is where the story begins with a very vivid description of a hunt. It introduces a character named James Fitzjames, a very mysterious knight who is actually King James V of Scotland in disguise. He becomes lost in the Highlands and is guided to a secluded island by Ellen Douglas. Ellen Douglas, by the way, is the daughter of a very high-profile man who lived in the Highlands and was exiled unjustly. The second cantos is called The Island, and this is where James becomes enchanted by Ellen and falls in love with her. Ellen, however, is already in love with a man named Malcolm. Malcolm is a Highlands chieftain, who means he's very high up in the clan, and Malcolm really supports her family's cause and her father. Malcolm is really upset that Ellen's father was exiled from the Highlands and is willing to fight for the Douglas family. Now, as James leaves the island, he offers Ellen a ring, telling her that if she touches it, it will summon his aid whenever she might need it. Now keep in mind, Ellen does not know that this is King James in disguise, but she takes the ring and is very appreciative of this gesture and was always very nice to James. The third cantos is called The Gathering. In this cantos, the poem shifts to another man named Roderick. Roderick is a fierce chieftain of Clan Alpine and is leading a rebellion against the king. Roderick is also in love with Ellen. So keep in mind, Roderick is not from the Highlands clan, he is from another clan called Alpine. Roderick is also in love with Ellen and wants her hand in marriage as part of his political alliance. Now, this canto includes the section often referred to as Ellen's third song, or the hymn to the Virgin. And in this scene, she is praying for protection amidst this very tense, perilous circumstance surrounding her family and her homeland. The text of Ellen's prayer begins with the lines, Ave Maria, maiden mild, and goes on to say, listen to a maiden's prayer. Thou canst hear through from the wild. Thou canst save amid despair. This part of the poem is arguably the heaviest and most authentic part of the poem. This is the part of the poem where Ellen shows not only her vulnerability, but the vulnerability of mankind, and how in a moment where your father has been exiled from a land, you also have this increasing tension between your clan, the Highlands clan, and the royal forces, and now the Alpine clan is coming in wanting to fight the royal forces and force you into marriage with them, which she does not want. She's feeling so lost and so helpless and so out of control. Feels like the world is just crumbling down around her, and in that moment of despair, she is turning to the Virgin Mary. This is what she is doing in her darkest hour, is praying to the Virgin Mary to save her and to hear her and to save her from this wild. She's saying, I know you can hear me. I know you can save me. In fact, you are the only being, spiritual being, previously human being, who can possibly help in this dire of a situation. The next cantos is called The Prophecy. In this cantos, Ellen and Roderick begin to argue heavily. Ellen rejects his advances, tells Roderick she does not want to marry him, and Roderick becomes infuriated with Ellen and her clan. Roderick then goes to war, raging war, against the king, seeking to avenge his clan and fight for his clan's independence. In this section, a very mysterious prophecy is revealed, which ends up foreshadowing very tragic events. The next cantos is called The Combat, and in this section, James, who is King James in disguise as a knight, Fitzjames, and Roderick come head to head in a single combat. This combat is brutal. It's bloody and violent, and it symbolizes the conflict between the Highland clans and the authority of the Scottish crown as well. Fitzjames, the knight in disguise, ultimately defeats Roderick, who then reveals his loyalty to his people and respect for his opponent, which makes it hard to hate Roderick because he is so loyal and so passionate in his cause. The poem ends with a section called The Guard Room, and in this final canto, Ellen uses the ring that Fitzjames gave her to seek his help. After she uses that ring, she learns that this is not just a knight. This is actually King James V in disguise. King James is absolutely touched by Ellen's loyalty and bravery, despite her not knowing who he was that entire time. And it's in that moment the king decides to forgive her father and brings him back to his homeland, and then he grants amnesty to the entire Douglas clan. Overall, the poem's themes of loyalty, love, and the struggle between tradition and progress really resonated with readers of that time, and still does to this day. This piece of work was met with an incredible response. The Lady of the Lake was a commercial triumph, to say the least, and sold over 25,000 copies within 8 months of its publication. This was a very very remarkable feat for any piece of work. The Lady of the Lake also ignited a wave of interest in Scottish culture and history. Many readers inspired by Scott's descriptions began traveling to the Scottish Highlands, especially to an area called Loch Katrine, which served as the setting for much of the poem. This Scot tourism was so significant, it really helped establish Scotland as a romantic travel destination, which we still see it as to this day. The poem also inspired numerous plays and operas throughout Scotland and Britain and all surrounding lands. It even probably reached 13-year-old Franz Schubert in the early years of its release. Franz Schubert was just an innocent teenager boy living in Germany during this time. It wasn't until 15 years later, when Franz was 28 years old, he decided to take the German translation of Walter Scott's poem and turn it into a musical composition. While unfortunately there is no direct documentation or personal account from Franz Schubert himself describing the moment he first read The Lady of the Lake by Sir Walter Scott, Schubert was known to draw inspiration from literature, and he often set German translations of English and Scottish works to music, just as he did with The Lady of the Lake. It's clear Franz was moved by the emotion and loyalty and romance of the entire poem, but he was specifically moved by the scene in the third canto, The Gathering, when Ellen was praying to the Virgin Mary for help. It was such a vulnerable and raw part of the poem and reflection of humanity. Even though Franz turned every canto into music, he was most proud of the section called Ellen's third song, Ave Maria. Now, of course, depending on which language you are directly translating Sir Walter Scott's poem to, some of the words may differ slightly, but one line is always exactly the same, no matter which language you're translating from. Ave Maria, which means Hail Mary. And the theme is also always the same, the concept of giving thanks and hailing the one and only Virgin Mary, making a plea with her in desperate times to have mercy on us and save us. It wasn't until 1853, 28 years after Franz published his composition, that a 35-year-old named Charles Gounod translated Ellen's third song, aka Ave Maria, to French. With this translation, he also switched up the arrangement slightly and very randomly decided to use Bach's Prelude in C major from the 1700s as the introduction to the piece. Now, as I said in the beginning, both of these pieces were very secular while still encompassing the underlying theme of humility and power within the song. Schubert's melody is certainly more straightforward, which makes it arguably more hauntingly beautiful and adaptable, while the version Charles created is also beloved, but more so it seems among classical audiences. Charles' version is also perceived to be more complex due to the counterpoint it has with Bach's Prelude, and this can make it seem busy to a casual listener, almost to the point of possibly losing the sentiment you feel when you listen to Schubert's. But one thing the Charles version achieved undoubtedly, though, was giving the song and the composition a boost in France and around the world, adding to its notoriety and widespread appreciation. Following its initial publication in 1825, Franz Schubert's Ave Maria, which originally was titled Ellen's Third Song, was appreciated by a very select group of admirers and musicians, but it didn't become a major success right away. During his lifetime, Schubert really struggled with limited recognition. Ave Maria was known mostly within very small Viennese musical circles. 3 years after Franz wrote Ave Maria, he passed away at the very young age of 31. His song, Ave Maria, gradually grew in popularity in the decades after his death, as many who followed his work, musicians, friends, and neighbors, were very frustrated that he hadn't garnered more popularity, and they were mourning his death through his music. They really pushed after he died for music publishers and other outlets to feature Ave Maria and to highlight this composition in every way that they could. Separately from Sir Walter Scott and Franz and Bach was a prayer. that had been read in Christian liturgies for centuries, called Ave Maria. It was originally in Greek, but was later translated to Latin. This Latin prayer was really what inspired Sir Walter Scott to insert that section in the third canto called the Hymn to the Virgin Mary. The prayer is based on scriptural passages from the Gospel of Luke, with its roots in two very key biblical moments. The first part of the Ave Maria prayer is derived from the moment when the angel Gabriel greets Mary during the Annunciation in Luke 1:28. He says, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you." The second part comes from Elizabeth's greeting to Mary during the Visitation in Luke 1:42, where she says, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." These verses, of course, like I said, were originally in Greek, later translated into Latin, and then became very commonly used in the early Christian church as general expressions of reverence for Mary. By the 6th century, these verses were very often recited as devotional phrases, although it never really became a formal Christian prayer. It was really around the 11th century the prayer started to develop a structure and a formality, and it began to be recited in its current Latin form. I think that's important to keep in mind because when Franz took the German translation of Scott's poem, of course, he had this prayer in mind already, but he was creating these lyrics to Ave Maria directly from Scott's poem. So it did not include the references to the blessings of the woman's womb as it does in later versions that were adapted to fit the Latin prayer. The original version that Franz translated is really more of a plea for help from Ellen to the Virgin Mary, which I personally think is far more touching and authentic to that story specifically in that moment. Of course, I love the Ave Maria prayer, but for different reasons. And I think it's important to realize that these were two almost entirely different scenarios. Ellen in the woods, in a very desperate and dire situation, making a plea for help, versus the Latin prayer, which is really more showing appreciation and hailing Mary and saying, "Blessed are you, blessed is the fruit of your womb." It's more of a general blessing and expression of gratitude than Ellen's very desperate moment when she is honoring the Virgin Mary, but in a way where she's like, "Please, I need help, I'm so lost." The original Ave Maria composition by Franz, that 1825 rendition, has over 100 million views on YouTube alone. Keep in mind that does not include the notoriety and accolades received from 1825 to just the mid-1900s, nonetheless through the 2000s to present day. I mean, it is truly one of those songs in music history that perfectly captures the fragility of the human spirit and the strength that we have through our divine Virgin Mary. It wasn't until the mid-1800s when other composers started using Franz Schubert's musical composition of Ellen's third song and started putting that to the words of the Latin prayer. This is when you started seeing the references to the blessings of the woman's womb. You see these references in all of the modern day versions of Ave Maria. If you look it up today, you will probably see in the very first Google results the lyrics, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of the womb." You will also see the phrases, "Jesus in your womb." This becomes formalized into not only a Latin prayer, but a hymn, and it started as just two references in the Bible. It was never a formal prayer until after Sir Walter Scott wrote this poem, until after Franz put that poem to music, and then people thought this really should become a formalized prayer. You know, people are reciting these phrases over and over, and they're praying to the Virgin Mary over and over with the same type of rhetoric, and you get this very beautiful formalized hymn out of all of this. Something that has withstood, like I said, centuries of mankind. All in all, there have been thousands, not hundreds, thousands of covers and different renditions done of Ave Maria by thousands upon thousands of composers, singers, violinists, choirs, you name it. Basically, every artist knows Ave Maria. Additionally, the Library of Congress features multiple recordings of Ave Maria in its National Jukebox collection, which just further illustrates its widespread appeal worldwide and nationwide. One of my favorite renditions of Ave Maria is the one that is done by Luciano Pavarotti and Dolores O'Riordan, singing it live, and I will link their live performance in the description here. It just seems so, not spooky, but kind of surreal to hear Dolores sing this song, given all of the hardships that she had in her own personal life. If you have not seen my full Roots documentary on Dolores O'Riordan, by the way, I did a whole episode on her a few months back, and I will link that in the description down below. But like I said, there are countless renditions of the song, and I would love it if you would comment on this video what your favorite rendition is. Ave Maria continues to be a fundamental part of not just our culture, but a fundamental part of humanity. Leona Lewis just did a very beautiful cover of it in 2020 as well. And then on October 5th, 2024, almost exactly 3 months from July 13th, 2024, President Trump returned to Butler, Pennsylvania for a triumphant rally. An amazing singer named Christopher was there and was scheduled to sing at this rally. But moments before the rally started, Trump changed the scheduled events and asked Christopher if he would be willing to sing Ave Maria at the exact moments bullets started to fly on July 13th.
Excuse me, Mr. Macchio, did you get a chance to see President Trump?
I just did. I just spoke with him, and he asked me to change the program to put Ave Maria at the exact moment that the shots rang out. I'm going to sing Ave Maria. He just asked me to do it, and I'm happy to do it.
At this time, it is 6:11, 12 weeks to the minute that the shooting began. I would like to ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence.
And then, for 3 powerful minutes, Ave Maria played over the loudspeakers at the exact moment that gunman had started shooting just 3 months prior. The version Christopher sang was a rendition that had been adapted to fit the Latin prayer, the most common versions that you see in modern day. I think that is, and was, the most appropriate version that could have possibly been sung there in that moment. Because in this version, it is praising the Virgin Mary. Yet there is still this underlying theme of humility where we are ever so praying that she prays for us, the sinners. This rally in Butler, Pennsylvania may indeed be the most powerful thing I've ever seen or witnessed in all of my years of life. Not only did President Trump play Ave Maria at this rally, but he played it at numerous rallies towards the end of the election campaign.
If they could work really quickly backstage while we're waiting, Ave Maria. We had Ave Maria the other day.
Paying tribute not only to the song itself, but the faith that we have in the all-holy Virgin Mary. All in all, the story of Ave Maria, with its origins rooted in faith, art, and human expression, has transcended centuries to become a cultural and spiritual touchstone. From its beginnings as very humble references in the chapter of Luke, to its evolution into a humble prayer, and then a global symbol of devotion, hope, and beauty, Ave Maria has touched countless lives, bringing solace in moments of sorrow and joy in times of celebration. Its enduring appeal lies in its universal message, a reverent expression of love, longing, and faith that resonates with people of all backgrounds. As new generations continue to discover and interpret Ave Maria, this timeless piece will remain a testament to the human spirit, weaving itself into the fabric of ceremonies, gatherings, and personal moments. Indeed, Ave Maria is more than just a song. It is a shared experience that will echo through the ages, reminding us of our deepest connections not only to each other, but to the sacred powers. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up button. You have no idea how much it helps to have an extra subscriber and thumbs up on a video for the YouTube algorithm, and it helps boost this video in YouTube's algorithm so it gets out to more people and more people can hear the story. You also have the option to give me a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel, and your donations have been so helpful in helping me improve my setup here, improve the research. If you look at some of the earlier videos that I did on the channel, you can tell the quality is much worse. So through your donations and super thanks, I have been able to upgrade my setup, upgrade the camera, the microphone, the research, the subscriptions that go into the research. So I am just forever grateful to anyone who has supported me through the super thanks option. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.